Hi, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Marion's Learning Labs webinar series, where we will be addressing a range of important issues in reading, learning, and student success. My name is Sarah Sasavari. I am the Education Coordinator at Dr. Marion's Learning Labs, and I will be hosting today's webinar. As today's host, I will be able to view and present any questions you may have for Dr. Blank through the question and answer box that is available on your screen. So please feel free to type any questions you'd like Dr. Blank to answer in that box for us to see. You may also see a chat box, but that has been disabled, so please ignore that and direct all your questions to the Q&A box. All right, now I'd like to turn things over to the star of our series, Dr. Marion Blank. She is an award-winning psychologist who is well known internationally for her many contributions to understanding and enhancing learning. Hi, Dr. Blank. Thank you for being here.
Hi, it's always a pleasure.
Well, I am excited to dive into today's topic where we will learn more about wrong responses. So I will hand it over to you, Dr. Blank.
Okay, and can we have the first slide? Okay, that's the title slide, which is fine.
Okay.
Now the next one, if you can get to it.
Yeah. Now?
Okay, yep, perfect.
Oh, finally.
Okay. So we start off with let me start off with the background that brought me into this. Many years ago, and it was during the time that was called teaching for enrichment. It was a period when there was a big push to help children from poverty areas to become more successful in school. And teachers were given the directive, ask stimulating questions, start challenging the children, and this is going to lead to very good results. And what happened was I was working in some pretty poor areas in New York City. And I was doing experiments with the kids, but I was in and out of the classrooms all the time. And I started looking at what the teachers were doing, and they were trying to do what they were told to do. And they were asking stimulating questions, supposedly for young children. And the kids were at a total loss. Some of them hid under their tables. Some came up with absolutely inappropriate responses. Some talked about their breakfast. They clearly didn't have a clue as to what was going on.
Mhm.
So I very innocently and naively went to the teacher and said, what are you doing? What training do you have for all the wrong responses that the kids are coming up with? The wrong responses ranging from I don't know to I have to go to the bathroom to I had steak for breakfast. And that was actually a kid who said that. And the teachers all looked at me as if I were a strange being. They said, we don't get any training.
Mhm.
And so I said, wow, this is remarkable. So I went to the literature and I found something amazing. There wasn't one paper then on what teachers should do with wrong responses. There were tons of papers, as there are now, on all the kids' wrong responses because it's the whole basis for diagnosis. That's if the kid can't read, fails in reading, he's dyslexic. If a kid is inattentive and doesn't listen to the teacher, he's got ADD. All our diagnoses are, not all, practically all, are based on the ability of or the inability of the children to answer the questions that are asked. And so I very innocently wrote a chapter because I was asked to write a chapter on something I wanted, and I wrote a chapter called The Wrong Response. Is it to be responded to, ignored, or something of that sort? It was what it was back in the 1970s, the only paper on treating the wrong response. You have this pandemic behavior, and it was ignored. What's interesting is that remarkably little has been done since that time. There are now more papers on it, but the guidance that the teachers are given is just inappropriate, unusable. For example, I was looking this up recently. what are teachers told to do? So one of the things teachers are told to do is to stay with the student and work out the confusions, which sounds very good, except
Mhm.
in a group situation, it's impossible. There is absolutely no way for a teacher to stay with the same student because she'll lose the rest of the group. I'm going to go off from this topic for a minute. One of the interesting things is, although teachers are not made aware of the wrong responses, kids are totally aware of them. So one day actually, when I was writing that paper, a student, a high school student, who had a learning disability, but a very diligent student, came into my office and he said, "Oh, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing a paper on the wrong response." I didn't have to say another word. You almost never have to say another word to children. They know exactly what the issue is because it's what terrifies them in the classroom. And he says, "You know what I do when I don't know the answer?" I said, "No, what?" He says, "I raise my hands." I said, "What? You raise why?" And I was very naive. He says,
Mhm.
"Well," he says, "if the teacher doesn't call on me, he thinks I know it, so I've made a good impression." And he says, "If he does call on me," I said, he went to a very demanding Catholic high school. He says, "If
Ah.
the teacher does call on me," I say, "Excuse me, sir, could you repeat the question?" He says, "And no teacher," he knew exactly what, like all the kids, he knew the dynamic. He said, "No teacher stays with the same student twice." So he then moves to another student to continue the discussion, and he never finds out that I didn't know the answer. So
Mm.
kids are, and that's, everyone's aware of it when they're a student. For example, if you go to a lecture hall, almost nobody ever sits in the first row if they think there's a chance that they'll be questioned if they sit in the first row. People have been terrified by the educational system and the fear of making a wrong response that'll make them look like a fool. So I wrote that paper and I've been interested in this topic for a long time. And what we'll do today is try and get into um, as many components as we can in the time available on what's happening and what can be done. Now, are the wrong responses significant? Well, a certain percentage of wrong responses is inevitable in any teaching learning situation. And if it's a low percentage, it's of little concern. Interesting in terms of studying children's thinking and so on, but it doesn't hold up the educational process. If there is a high percentage, and what is that? We can hazard a guess as to what the high percentage is. They're a cause of major concern. Basically, probably anything exceeding 30% makes the dialogue or the discourse fall apart. Anyway, given that even though we don't have the figures on it because no one does the research on it, we know that the majority of children in the United States, the official figures have been consistently for the last several years, 65% failure rate in reading. Given that you have that high failure rate, it's certain that a high percentage of failures are pandemic. That's what we are living with, and that's what both the student and the teacher suffer from. It's a terrible situation that does neither party any good. Can I have the next slide?
Yeah.
Now, in order to even begin dealing with this area, we have to start thinking in terms of language and communication in the classroom. Because the wrong responses usually are verbal responses. And so what's happening with the language in the classroom when this happens? Well, it's very important to recognize, and it is very rarely recognized, that language and communication are used synonymously, but they are very different behaviors. They're interwoven behaviors, but they're very different behaviors. Language is a skill within an individual. And it's an important skill, but it doesn't have any necessary connection to communication. For example, when people dream, there's tons of language, but there's no communication going on. It's all within the person. But communication is a behavior, a skill, or an interaction pattern among individuals. So what we're concerned with, and that's what's happening with the wrong response, the teacher has initiated questions and the students have produced wrong responses. The language in the classroom is always communication. That means we have to start considering at least two participants, the teacher and the student. Now, there are vast numbers of papers and books on what the teacher is doing, what the teacher should do, vast numbers of pages of books and articles on the student and what he or she is or is not doing in the classroom. The two have not been put together because currently there are almost no behavioral science systems that can treat two individuals. And until we get that really established, we're going to be held up. But that doesn't mean we can't proceed and do some important work. Okay, can I have the next slide?
Yeah.
Now, the pattern of communication in the classroom typically is that the teacher initiates and the student responds. So a question might be, let's say in a science class, what are the different ways animals have of moving? So now there is a recognition that the teacher dominates the language. And one of the solutions offered is that the children should talk more and the teacher talk less. That is a disastrous solution, which if anyone wants to raise questions about it, I'll be pleased to answer. But it would be comparable, for example, for you going to a doctor and the doctor says, you know, I noticed I talk all the time. Why don't you start talking to her and I want to give you a chance. Tell me what you're thinking. You would rightly be very concerned because the doctor is not assuming his or her role with the patient. The doctor should be guiding, leading, structuring the interaction. That's why you went to the doctor. And the same thing holds in the school. There, the teacher should be guiding and structuring and leading the interaction. And the advice that we should be having children talk more just fails again to take account of the role relationships and the purpose of those relationships. I do not mean to say that children shouldn't speak. They should speak and should feel comfortable speaking, but they should not be controlling the dialogue. The teacher is the teacher. The teacher is the master of the situation, and that the teacher's responsibility is to guide the children to a level of understanding that enhances their functioning. Okay, next slide.
Absolutely. Now, before we move on really quick, we actually had a webinar about decontextualized questions, and that is available on dmlearninglab.com for anyone who was not able to attend. Would you please clarify for those viewers who may have not been able to attend what a decontextualized question exactly is?
A decontextualized question is, let's say, and it goes on frequently in the school. So, for example, if I said to you, you know, Sarah, we're talking about language. What is language? And those questions go on in the classroom. There's no context. There's no information surrounding it. And the person is just sort of like, what am I supposed to say? I can't. Now, what's very interesting, and we may not be able to address it very much here, but the fact of the matter is that in school, no, let me start somewhat differently. Many years ago in England, about 40, 50 years ago, there was a well-known sociolinguist called Basil Bernstein. And he wrote a lot about language in different contexts. And he made a distinction between what he called private language and public language. Private language is the stuff that we do in everyday life with the people we live with, the people we like, the people we don't like. It doesn't matter. These are the casual, informal exchanges. So, for example, a partner could come home one night and say, you won't believe it, he did it again. And the partner knows exactly what the person means because they know the person. So a private language is an important part of our lives, but it goes on between people who know each other well and don't need to specify their ideas. Right. Public language is the language of thinking, of reasoning, of public discourse, where the arguments have to be very explicit. By arguments, I mean the lines of reasoning have to be very explicit. They have to be sequenced. They have to be related to one another. It follows a very definite pattern. And so if you go to a good lecture, for example, if the lecturer knows what he or she is doing, you will get all the context you need. They will say something like, oh, I just saw one yesterday. It was very interesting. One of my students told me to watch it. It was a Black musician in the South who suffered tremendously from discrimination. And what he did was to link up with people in the Ku Klux Klan to try and understand them. So but he in the first 3 or 4 minutes, you know exactly what he's doing and where he's headed.
Right.
One of the things that's happened, and it isn't discussed enough, is the teacher has said the same thing so often to so many kids that he or she makes the public language into a private language.
Mhm.
And so so as we'll talk, can I have the next slide? Maybe it's there.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah.
Okay, we'll wait on this, but what happens is the teacher will, and you'll see it later, will do things like, as an opening bit, people don't believe me, this happens, this is in the literature. Teacher starts a class, okay, current events, Glenn. People say, no, teachers don't talk like that. They do talk like that. And they talk like that because they've heard the current events now for 15 years. They think the kids understand it the way they see it, and they've made a public language into a private language. If that issue alone were remedied, the failure rate would drop enormously within a year. And we'll come back to this issue. But here's now an example of providing the context, which is rarely provided. In other words, if you're going to ask what are different ways of animals have of moving, you could preface it by a statement, not a question, a statement saying some animals move by flying, others by crawling. So the kids now, and you could show some interesting pictures or funny pictures or a whole variety of things. So the kids have a very clear image of what you're talking about. And then it's quite legitimate and productive to say, what are the different ways animals have of moving, if you want to go into that topic. In other words, there is nothing holding us up in reality from doing this, but there is something holding us up, which is the response I get from so many people. They say, but you're telling him the answer, which means a number of things. First of all, I say, yeah, I'm a teacher, so I can teach. And people don't know what to do when I say that. But the other thing is, basically what they're saying, and it's not acknowledged, is you're constantly testing the kids. So in other words, you can't tell the answer because you're testing. And if you can't test, if you tell them, the test is valueless. So instead, you ask these very poorly formulated questions that give no context, and they produce failure. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with telling the answer, except if it's boring. There are good ways of telling the information. And by the way, I didn't provide the answer. I just provided the context that allows the kids to find the answer more readily. But I cannot tell you the number of times people have told me, no, I can't, you can't do that. And meaning teachers should not talk in comment form. And I'm saying teachers must talk in comment form before any questions.
And I find that to be so interesting because to increase the chances of a correct response, you often need to give an example, a model to help guide your learner to see what they want, right? This is not giving the answers. This is just increasing the likelihood of a correct action or response and decreasing the chances of a wrong response. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But it also increases the knowledge base that the children need. And we know that knowledge base is a disaster zone currently for a variety of reasons. Kids don't read a lot. They don't listen to nice informational videos on, let's say, public broadcasting. They are increasingly not reading. So they come with a very poor background knowledge. And what you're doing is providing, hopefully in an interesting way, the background knowledge that they need. So, okay, let's move on. Now, so this is transforming the guidelines. For example, and this affects a huge amount of the guidance teachers get. The current advice is teachers should ask challenging questions. Now that is, if you really investigate it, ridiculous. So today, for example, I asked a teacher, I said, I have a very interesting question. How did Einstein come up with his idea about E equals MC squared when no one else thought about it? Well, I would guarantee you that 99.9% of the world would just look at you like you're absolutely insane. They don't know where to even begin. I can come up with, and you can come up with dozens of challenging questions. All you're going to do is produce failure. And that's exactly what's happening in the school. The unrecognized reality is that the advice is producing the wrong responses that lead the kids to be labeled whatever, learning disabled, autism spectrum disorder, hyperactivity disorder, and so on. That the questions, because the statistics on academic achievement in the United States are painful. So who can manage the system? It's the top level schools will cherry pick the best students. It's probably around 5 to 10% of the school population. And then the rest of the kids are basically mistreated or ignored. No one benefits from the way the classroom is set up. The 5 to 10% don't benefit. It just allows them to get into the better universities, but it isn't their education is better. And for the vast majority of students, the endless questioning with no supporting material is just a deadly source. Okay, next slide. So one of the things, and this is going to take a long time because it's not available, we have to start, if we're going to consider classroom communication, we have to start with 2 participants, at least, the teacher and the student or students. So if we take the example of teachers should ask challenging questions, the real question is, or the real request is, teachers should ask challenging questions of students who can understand and respond to those questions. Now, that can occur at any age, starting at 3 years of age for preschoolers and going up through university for the college student. We have to, but this means changing the teaching. The changing of the teaching, we have the knowledge base to do it if we turn to it. It will make the school situation much more pleasant for not only the students, but for the teachers as well, because the teachers currently are working on advice that is not sufficient to meet the challenges they face. So we have the nice thing, and that I've said this to many people, I never work on a problem if I don't think there's a solution. What's the point of saying, oh, here's a problem? But if you have, and we do have the paths to a solution, if you have the paths to a solution, it's a fabulous situation.
And that's the good news. And that gives us all hope, right? That we can all fix this.
Yeah, the amazing thing is we have the information we need.
Exactly.
But we're not using it.
Exactly.
Next slide. Okay. Now, how do we can just put out some of the guidelines for dealing with the wrong response. I mean, it's a big topic, and I hope this will just stimulate people to think about it more, read about it more. But here is the first step in advice. The curriculum provided to the teachers, not that the teachers develop the curriculum, the curriculum provided to the teachers must contain the information the students need. It should not be based on asking the students for that information. So you won't get questions like, who can tell me who Abraham Lincoln was? Or what is the main issue today in climate control? Or what was the biggest development in, let's say, interplanetary travel in the last 5 years? It's what you're doing is saying, I got to find the bright student or the informed student and get him to say it, because I am a teacher and I'm not allowed to teach, which is basically the current situation.
Right.
We have to abandon the advice, but you're telling them the information. That is one of the worst pieces of advice. This decontextualized generalization is, if we abandon it, pathways are open to us. Okay.
Okay.
Let's see the next question, slide, sorry. Now, so a second thing is we have to start attending to two aspects of communication, two central aspects of communication that are rarely discussed. People commonly talk about questions in the classroom. People will say, oh, the teacher asked challenging questions. But in fact, there are two main modes of speaking. One is comment form. That means you say something in a statement that does not require an answer. It can be responded to. So for example, if I say at the beginning of let's say a discussion on climate change, say we're in a period where there's a lot of concern about what's happening with our climate, what's happening in terms of hurricanes, what's happening in terms of volcanoes, and so on. As soon as I say that, no one has to say anything, but as soon as I say that, it registers. The information is given slowly, it's given in a redundant manner, and it's given hopefully with interesting material. And one of the huge advantages of the current age is our graphics are phenomenal. So you can find beautiful illustrations of almost any idea you could raise. Once you put those, and we know kids are visual, once we give that information, we've transformed the teaching automatically. So teachers need training and understanding the powers and limitations of comments and questions. They need to know how to present them. They need to, so they provide information that the students need. This includes knowing, and this is very important, how to select relevant films and other key information sources. Again, we're abandoning the dictum, but you're telling them the information. What I'm saying is you've got to find the right information that that brings the child into the world that you're talking about. And with that, one of the interesting things is so many teachers will say to me, I have to ask a question very fast because otherwise I lose a group. And so the whole pressure to speak very fast and it's gone. You now have interest material that the kids like looking at and like learning about. And the whole pace is now slowed down, which it must be slowed down if the kids are to learn. You know, it's very interesting. I consulted on the design of Sesame Street. And at that time, I raised the same point. It was a lot of years ago. And what they said is they have to put the information fast because they need eyes on the screen. Well, you
even
get
with
eyes on
Sesame
the
Street.
screen, but you don't get any ability to take that information in. Basically, what had happened was, and this is another misguided notion. What happened was, although Sesame Street was not sponsored by business, the designers were told, you've got to keep the same amount of eyes time, same amount of time where kids spend their eyes on the screen as happens with commercial television. So basically, Sesame Street had to model itself on the design of the ads that are used on commercial television. No one talks about it. It was a major factor in why Sesame Street couldn't achieve its goals. It did not. It was tremendously popular, but it did not achieve its goals of really getting the kids to learn what they hoped they would learn. So time is a vital factor, and the presentation of information is done in a way that slowly expands the ideas, so that the children have the ability to follow them. And decontextualized questions just are torture, and so you have to give them in this bullet-like manner that doesn't do anybody any good.
Right.
Next. I hope you don't hear all the sirens that are outside. That's New York, and you can't do it. Okay. Okay, so this is an example of the missing ingredient. When I showed this to a teacher recently, she says, "Oh, this doesn't happen in the classroom." I said, "Well, it's in the literature. It's part of a major paper in a major journal talking about," they weren't talking about this issue. They were talking about some of the aspects of classroom language. In any event, what happened was this dialogue was in the chapter. Teacher starts off the lesson. I mentioned this before. Current events, Glenn. And Glenn, a very nice student who really wants to do well. It's obvious with his answer. Pablo Casals died last week. I mean, the fact that he knew Pablo Casals and he was giving that meant this kid has a lot of information. Teacher does nothing in response. She turns instead to another student, Sam. And Sam says the war in the Middle East is still going on. Teacher now gives a response, yes. And what just happened this week? Now, I can get a lot of answers from teachers when I ask this question, but why didn't the teacher say what she meant in her first question? In other words, she really, if this is the comment kind of thing that I'm talking about, she really was thinking there have been a lot of big developments in the Middle East in the last few days. This is obviously for a high school type curriculum. Does anyone know what these have been? But she's been told never to do that. And what happens is this leaves the children with a confusing, mystical code in the classroom. They say she's not allowed to say to a student, "You're wrong." But first of all, he wasn't wrong, but she could have easily said something like, "Yeah, that's absolutely true, and that's great, you know about it. But I really wanted to speak about international affairs, so my question is somewhat different." And then she goes back. But teachers don't speak in that way. So what happens is Glenn, if he is smart enough, says, "I better just shut up because I obviously don't know what she wants." Some kids, particularly those, which is very strange, people will find this strange, particularly those on the autism spectrum who are committed to trying to do well, will say, "I don't know why she turned it down. I can't figure it out," because they can't do the subtleties of that kind of thing. But Sam knows. And Sam knows that this teacher wants international developments, and Sam gives her what she wants. And so she continued. So it's like a secret code in the classroom, which about 10% of kids break. 90% of the kids never break the code, except to know that they're in trouble. If you speak to kids who are dyslexic or ADD or whatever, they'll tell you the misery they have in the classroom. But because this situation is impossible for them. Okay, let's move on.
Okay.
Here's an example, because basically what has happened, there are interesting reasons why, we can't go into it today. Much of the classroom is designed to be testing, not teaching. And this is, I experienced this a lot because I used to raise my hand. Well, let's do the example. Who was the first president of the United States? 3 students raised their hands. And she turns to the one student and says, "No, not you, Jeff. Emily." And the reason she did that, she knows Jeff has the answer. The teacher is not sure that Emily has the answer. So she's testing Emily to see if Emily has improved or not. This is an impossible feat in a classroom, There is no way that the teacher can do anything if the student can't answer. And all she's done is make this problematic student feel worse about themselves. So what, it's very, I'll give you a biographical note. I used to always raise my hand. I was very bored in the classroom and I wanted to speak, and I was a little sort of hyperactive. And so I raised my, teachers would always say to me, not you, Marion, you know the answer. And I know that still goes on today. So what I did after a while is I just tuned out. I wasn't a behavior problem. I just tuned out. I used to look out the windows. We had lovely big windows in New York City school. And then one day I hear, and what do you think, Marion? So I said, oh God. So I didn't know. She says, well, next time you'll listen, won't you? So here I'm in a situation where they won't answer, they won't let me speak because they knew I knew the answer. So they're asking questions where there has to be a fighting chance of failure, which is just counterproductive. And so I realized that what I should do and this is what I did for many, many terms. I raised my hand. I didn't pay attention to the dialogue was so boring. I raised my hand. I was never called on, and the teacher was happy and I was happy, and life went on. And what I did, what many learning disabled students do, they find a coping mechanism that allows them to get by. I mean, I knew all the answers. What was the point of my listening to those questions? Because I knew the answers. But I had to pretend I didn't know the answers so that the teacher wouldn't then get me embarrassed by saying, well, next time you'll listen, won't you, Marion? And so next time I didn't listen, but I looked as if I listened, and I got by. And this is what the kids the better poor students do that. They say, I want to give a good impression. A lot of the kids just give up. I've had kids I've seen, I've worked with kids who just walk out of the classroom, and the teacher, this was in New York City. We always had a bunch of tough kids. And so one of the kids was walking out of the class. He said, and the teacher says, no, Lewis, you can't do that. And he says, I'll do what I want. And what is the teacher going to do? So the current situation is really so bad for the teacher and the student. Let's move.
Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. It went to the, here you go. Now we're on the right slide.
Okay. Now, basically, wrong responses are touched upon in the literature now, at least that's an advance, but they're not grappled with. I spent some time just the last few days just looking up some of the techniques. So for example, teachers are told they should probe for more information when they get a wrong response. How can they possibly do that in a group situation? This could be possible in one-to-one, but public education is not set up for one-to-one education. If they probe for more information, they're going to lose the class, the group dynamic of the class. So there is absolutely no way. Another response was, give the student more time to, these are other people's work. I did not make these up.
No.
Give the student more time to come up with a better response. Again, you're going to lose the class. Nobody is going to, in this day and age, where kids are used to rapid fire information, they're going to sit there quietly in a contemplative mode and say, gee, let me think about that issue. It does. So and you can, that would be, if any group or of people, whether homeschoolers or teachers, would like to work on this issue, it's a fascinating one. What do you do in a one-to-one situation, which we're not going to cover today, but we will in another time, versus a group situation? You've got to see if your advice is possible in a group. Every suggestion that I read recently, and I went through a lot of literature, there wasn't one that would work in a group setting. So these just don't take account of the key issues in the communication setting. The basic fact of classroom life is a teacher cannot maintain attention on one child in a group setting. But if the dialogue and the discourse is good, all the children will be involved, and she will not be, or he will not be confronted with endless wrong responses. The whole level of the discourse of the classroom would improve dramatically. And so there is a solution, but we
There
can't.
is a solution.
What is that? I'm sorry, Sarah.
I said there is a solution.
Oh, there
Yes,
is
it's a great
definitely a
point.
solution, but we can't continue to say, well, we're going to keep the classroom the way it is,
Right.
where you give these rapid fire, decontextualized questions that demand background knowledge that the children don't have. I mean, that's like saying, I have a car and I really want to go on a long trip. It's a little problem. Only one wheel works. Well, don't even start your trip. It's foolish. And
Right.
that's the same thing here. We've got a car that needs to be changed. And what I'm hoping, the nice thing is it's fun to change it. And I'm hoping people will start doing that. Let's
I
have
hope so too. Yeah.
So summary. The teachers must stop asking questions requiring background knowledge. The teacher must provide the necessary background knowledge via statements. Now, let me ask you a question. Did you have any training, Sarah, in your training as a teacher in how to make how to present information in statement form to students?
No.
I've never met a teacher who has had that training. And it is absolutely vital. It's not hard. It takes 4 to 6 weeks to get into that mode because we're not used to it, but it's not hard to train. And what you have to do is help the teachers develop ways for recognizing the best information that they should be presenting. Of course, the teachers actually should be given good curricula, but they're not.
Yeah.
And until they're given good curricula, teacher will have to sort of work together to try and get it.
Right.
And the use of film clips is fabulous. There is and I don't know, this will vary from state to state and school to school, but there are fabulous film clips that can demonstrate almost any issue you want to raise in whatever curriculum you're using. There are films, for example, about Lincoln, if you're doing biography of Lincoln. There are films about World War II if you're doing things in history. There are excellent films about the development of the atomic bomb. This would be high school level if you're doing science and so on. The range of those materials is enormous, and it doesn't mean you give an hour's presentation of the film. It means you give 3 or 4 minutes of a critical scene, explain it, and then move on from there. And then each bit of information, so let's say the teacher talks for 30 seconds or 90 seconds. I'm not saying lecture. They'll talk and ends it with a well-formulated question that is not too complex, but makes the point you want the children to see or the students to see. In other words, this may sound a bit unnerving because nobody talks about this, but really it doesn't require a lot of training. And if we were willing to develop the curricula, it would make the teacher's life really much easier. And their lives should be made much easier because they've been given a terribly hard job to do.
Absolutely. As a former teacher, I can attest to that as well. So,
yeah. I've been with teachers who have told me that they have to design the curriculum. They're told, you're just so inventive. All you have to do is design. God, it's hard to design curriculum, let me tell you, because I do it all the time.
Yeah.
So this is that's the end of our. Did we reach it? Okay.
Yes, that is the end. And because we had some technical difficulties, we have hit our 45-minute mark. However, because it took a couple minutes, I would like to just address at least one question, if that's okay, that we got a couple questions today from some of our attendees. And I would like to pick at least just one, and I apologize for those that we haven't been able to get to. Please feel free after this to go to our website at gmlearninglab.com to send any additional questions. But I would love, if you don't mind, Dr. Blank,
and we
to cover
promise
just one.
To answer. We promise to answer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we will do at least one today. Let's just pick randomly. What do you do in a classroom setting when only one child raises their hand? That was a question that we got on one of the slides.
Actually, there's no reason we could abandon that. It sounds there's no reason for the children to raise their hands or not raise their hands. What you could, in other words, if a teacher is prepared a well-designed, has prepared well-designed verbal material, he or she can then ask a question and call on a particular kid, or say, even allow free speaking, where kids will volunteer as they would, as you might, let's say, at a dinner party conversation. You know? So the whole business of finding the kid who's going to save you, which is what teachers do all the time because they're given inadequate techniques, you don't need it anymore. It'll just happen. And especially, I'll close with one bit of teaching that I thought was brilliant. For some reason, well, they were teaching Shakespeare in Harlem. Harlem is it's changed, but was a very rough part of New York where you had a lot, for the most part, lower class, poor Black families. So his job was to teach Hamlet. And when he said to me, I was so impressed. He said to me, this is what he did. He said, imagine, he says, it was a class of boys, but he says, imagine that you had traveled away from your family. You're around 20 years old. You went off from you and you were away for a couple of years. And you come back. And you come back and you find out your father's dead. And you had no idea this had happened. He says, and then you find out that your father's brother, your uncle, probably killed him. And then you find out that that brother-in-law, no, the brother, married your mother. What would you do? Well, he says the students are ready for blood. They're saying, that's ridiculous. And then he gets a whole bunch of responses, no questions. The kids are just producing them. And he says, well, let's see what Hamlet did, because he was facing that situation. And so he presented the whole thing of what Hamlet needed. It took all of 3 or 4 minutes, and he had everybody engaged. This is all very doable, which is the good news. And hopefully, we're going to start doing it.
Hopefully. Well, I thank you so much, Dr. Blank. This was such a valuable webinar where we got so much information, and I'm really looking forward to the next webinar with you as well.
And hopefully we won't have any technical difficulties.
Hopefully not. And to our wonderful attendees, I apologize about the technical difficulties. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to go to our website at gmlearninglab.com. You can direct any questions you have for Dr. Blank there. You will also be able to view all of our webinars there as well. And so please share with everyone and let them know. We look forward to hopefully seeing you all at the next webinar. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for your time today.
Bye.